Okay, as promised, this is our second video on chapter 1 of Utilitarianism, and the chapter is entitled What Utilitarianism Is. Dr. Brownouts has produced an excellent outline of this chapter, and he's also set out, well, we're looking at chapter 2 now, the 8 objections that Mill raises and counteracts. So just going to show you one little image here. This is of a chess match, and any top philosopher is like a chess player in the sense that they anticipate every possible attack that could come at them and they block that off. So you look at Garry Kasparov here. He would form a defense move, but he would know what every single piece on the opposition's board could do, and he would have a system for responding to that. So if we go back to chapter 2, we're going to start with our first objection and respond to that. Just a little preface. Mill is an inductive thinker. That's to say, he goes off observation and experience. He's looking at human conduct, at the psychology of human nature, which pursues pleasure and avoids pain. And that's uniformly across human society. Now, Bentham supposes this to be kind of quantitative and for all pleasure to be uniform. And hedonic utilitarianism tends to sort of produce quite a homogeneous view of pleasure. Mill wants to complicate that a little bit and say he's fully prepared to accept that virtue is extremely useful in maximizing our pleasure. We should train children and citizens to be virtuous, to have a disposition towards truth-telling or sympathy to their fellow humans, kindness, generosity. We should instill that in people. Rules are the accumulated wisdom of past experience, and he's going to say that's tremendously important. Motives are important. So rules, motives, duties, these are all things that add to the general sum of happiness. But the first principle, the primary end, is still pleasure. So he's a hedonic utilitarian. People sometimes pit pluralism against hedonism in that there are many different ends that we can have in ethics, not just pleasure. Mill is going to say, yes, it is pleasure, but pleasure is complex. There are higher and lower pleasures. There's a value to rules, virtue, character in achieving that end. So let's look at this first chapter now. So he says, or second chapter, he says that pleasure comes in many different forms on page 185. Beauty and pleasure. There's a plurality of forms of pleasure. And he's going to set out on page 186 this creed, the foundations of morality. He says, utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation, the absence of pleasure. That's his definition. So he's saying pleasure is inherently good in and of itself, whereas other supposed ends of morality are only good insofar as they help us pursue this ultimate end. So we might say with Immanuel Kant that the summum bonum is to do your duty. That's the ultimate good, not to seek pleasure, but to do your duty. But Mill says, no, duty is, of course, useful, but only insofar as it helps you achieve the ultimate end of ethics, which is pleasure. So it's the only intrinsically good thing, inherently good thing in and of itself. Now, he's going to raise the first of 8 objections. Number 1, the swine objection. That essentially it's a swinish morality. And this is to say, an old charge against the Epicureans, who were kind of, in some senses, early progenitors of utilitarianism, and that pleasure as an end in itself just ends up being like, pigs in the sty, just looking for pleasure all the time, rolling around in the mud, in fairly lowbrow pursuits of the body. That's the kind of stereotype that's presented of it. But he wants to dismantle this idea. And he says the Epicureans valued the pleasures of the intellect. They saw the superiority of the mental over the bodily pleasures, page 187. They saw this because mental pleasures have greater permanency, safety, and they don't cost us anything. Learning is an end in itself, and it opens up lots of other future gains. So you have to take into account quantity, but also quality. If you think of the example Chris gives of Haydn and the oyster can have an almost infinity of low-level bodily pleasures, but Haydn as a composer, can have far higher quality of pleasures. The superiority of quality outweighs quantity and renders it by comparison of small account. So we should have a preference for those that are competently acquainted. He's going to move on to the idea of competent judges. He says, few creatures would consent to be chained to any of the lower animals for the promise of a fullest allowance of the beast's pleasures. No intelligent human would consent to be a fool. So the first charge, that this is just kind of swine morality, that it has no sensibility for pleasures of the mind or wider pleasures of self-sacrifice or whatever. He dismantles that idea and says, no, we value quality of pleasure as well as quantity. It's certainly not morality for pigs. And he mentions this idea of dignity, the dignity of human beings, and the capacity for nobler feelings that we have. Liberty, freedom is tremendously important for human expression, and we can hold a sense of pride in nobler feelings. So utilitarianism doesn't kind of lead to this, just drink beer and eat ice cream and candy floss kind of low view of pleasure, swinish morality. No, it can express the richest of human achievements, noble dignity. It can see the value of character development, of sacrificing your happiness for the general good. It can lead to the noblest and most dignified of pleasures and sense of self-worth. It needn't be that. And he recognizes that it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it's only because they know their own side of the story, not both. So this is really his first objection, and he's prepared to acknowledge that, of course, under the influence of temptation or weakness of character, we can often choose the lesser pleasure and indulge ourselves to the injury of health. And in our weakness, we can go for lower rather than higher pleasures. But there's a certain dignity in the human mind and character when you know you've acted from the noblest of intentions and you act wisely. Men lose their high aspirations as they lose their intellectual tastes because they have not time or opportunity for indulging them, and they addict themselves to inferior pleasures. But competent judges always know, having experienced both higher and lower pleasures, that the higher pleasures are better. And he uses lots of legal language here. He says there's a verdict of the only competent judges, and there's no appeal. They're qualified, their judgment is final, and there's no other tribunal to be referred to. All of this is kind of legal language that's suggesting that he's moving you towards a proof that utilitarianism as judged by competent judges, deems higher pleasures of the mind better than those of the body, and therefore it's not guilty of this swinish morality charge that it's just simply people pursuing bodily pleasures and neglecting dignity or virtue or duty. We've mentioned Henry Sidgwick, who's the third great utilitarian after Bentham and Mill, and he says the biggest problem in ethics is how you balance self-love, self-interest, over against benevolence, the greatest good of the greatest number. That's the real challenge in ethics. And Mill thinks that pleasures aren't homogeneous, they're not of one type. There's lots of different types of pleasure, and how we measure this can only be done through the standard of utility. If we're going to kind of compare and contrast pleasures, then we're going to need some set of scales and balancing out the agent's own greatest happiness with the greatest amount of happiness altogether, and taking an impartial stance as a noble character is a very good end. We should seek the greatest happiness principle, which is the ultimate end of morality. And he acknowledges that the general cultivation of nobleness of character is something that will help bring about that end. So he has, in many senses, demolished this charge that utilitarianism just looks out for your own interests and quite bodily pleasures at that. And he says, no, all of the highest sentiments and noblest, most dignified elements of human aspiration can be expressed in utilitarianism. Charge number 2, that happiness isn't attainable and it isn't the highest value for human beings. There's lots of traditions in ethics that would emphasize self-sacrifice and renunciation. He uses this German word Entsagen to speak of renunciation. So there's one example that might be an alternative, a rival to the claim that pleasure is the greatest good. Many would say that that's not the end, that we should be seeking pleasure. But he says utility doesn't just include the pursuit of happiness, but the mitigation of unhappiness. And this is often its priority. You know, think of a world with the bottom billion people not knowing where the next meal's coming from. And surely we should lift that as a priority over us having another kind of cinema ticket or another music album or spending on luxuries. We should be concerned about the bottom billion and the people most suffering in the world. So utilitarianism isn't just concerned with maxing out your own pleasures. It's often with the more urgent task of minimizing, mitigating people's suffering. He talks in his own day about the wretched education. And remember that in Mill's day, he died in 1873. In 1870, the Education Act came in that brought 2 million children of primary age out of illiteracy and lacking in education. Things were changing in his day, but there were wretched circumstances in the 19th century, wretched social arrangements for children growing up, and wretched education he refers to on page 191. So we should not just think that, far from charging utilitarianism with this claim that, you know, there's no limit to what happiness and pleasure you can pursue. He wants to say, no, utilitarianism is as equally, if not more urgently, attending to the problem of mitigating suffering. And in its day, that's a very urgent problem, as it is in our day. And we have to pursue this end. He also talks about how we have tranquility, you know, leading a calm and content life on the one hand, and everyone desires that, and excitement. You know, so if you leave too tranquil a life, it can become dull and insipid. But if you are always kind of going out for extreme sports, or to explore the North Pole, or to be a cutting-edge scientist that's pushing yourself to 70-hour weeks in your research, then you will at some point long for tranquility to balance out the excitement that you've been sacrificing your personal happiness for so long. So we always have to balance out pleasure and pain on a personal level and also on a national level. And Mill recognizes that we have to develop our own affections. You know, he one of the things that led to his kind of burnout at 20 was this sense that even if he achieved the greatest good, the greatest number, but he neglected his own personal happiness, would he be happy? And he concluded that he wouldn't. And so in the reading of poetry and the discovery of art and music and love with Harriet Taylor, he developed a cultivated mind that was broader in its view of pleasure, more fulfilled, and there is a richness to the range of human happiness, and the balancing out of self-interested egoism with the public good is something that we all have to resolve, but we have to attend to our own happiness in order to have the energy to kind of give to other people as well. So there's a balance to be found there, but you can't accuse utilitarianism. He's saying that it's unattainable. There's an awful lot to attain. And one of the points that he makes at the bottom of page 192 is most of the great evils in the world are removable if we continue to progress in science and we improve in the wisdom of society. The most intractable of our enemies, disease, may be reduced by good moral education and good physical progress. Now, if you think about the plagues of the past that could kill 20 million people, you know, you think about coronavirus, the progress we've made in science, the speed with which we'll probably be able to trial and get to the stage of a you know, cure for this virus or a response to it will be faster than any previous virus has been, and that's something that Mill would point to. So we have at our hands the urgent task of dealing with the immense suffering of people, and we can make huge progress and improvement. So far from telling utilitarians this is an unattainable achievement, you know, pure happiness, who can possibly aim for that? You know, to be alive is enough, you should be content with that. Mill says, no, there is massive amount to be done in mitigating suffering, not just in maximizing pleasure, and we can make massive progress. He was for a while in Parliament, extending the right to vote to women, bringing in education at the primary school level, dealing with how the poorest in Victorian society were provided for. These are all areas in which huge progress can be made. So far from saying this is unattainable, utilitarianism is a social reforming movement that thinks massive strides forward can be made. So another criticism, number 3, is that it's too demanding, the demandingness problem. We mentioned before, if you judge everything on the basis of consequences, you might say you ought to give to the point that your sacrifice is equal to the suffering of the bottom billion. So, for instance, I could say I have 2 kidneys. I should give one away because there are people in need of kidneys, and that's what's insane about the demands utilitarianism can make upon you, because there are no limits to them. You should give away all of your luxuries until your level is at that of the bottom billion. Well, you know, you can hardly afford to live in the West if you did that. So it's too demanding. And he wants to say, no, this is not true. It can call for great sacrifices, but the sacrifices have to be to some end. People would say, you know, look at the hero who's a martyr or a saint. Don't they make massive sacrifices? Well, Mill wants to say the only justification for huge sacrifice is that others that follow on from you don't have to suffer that. If we admire a soldier, for instance, for maybe throwing themselves on a grenade that's about to explode in order to save the lives of the rest of their battalion or their immediate peers, and that's what makes sacrifice immensely fruitful. He mentions at the bottom of page 193 that the ascetic mounted on his pillar doesn't really deserve admiration, because he's not really producing pleasure for people that come after him. So I'm just going to share the screen here and show you. This is Simeon Stylites in northern Syria. I've been to what remains of his pillar, which was 20 meters high, and they used to sort of wench up to him food, and he'd hand down his dirt, and he lived above there for decades. He's a bit like a walnut, really. And people would come and travel from Britain. He was one of the most famous celebrities of the 5th century, Simeon Stylites. Now, people admired him because he was an ascetic. He kind of, reduced the desires of the body entirely and lived for another world, and there's something heroic about him. Mill says, no, there's not. He's not really benefiting people. He's denying himself all pleasure, but to what end? What does he produce? Does he lower the suffering of other people? Does he increase the suffering of the pleasure of himself? Maybe he feels he's bringing a certain religious dignity to his life. But Mill says this is a pretty pointless activity because it doesn't serve any particular end, and therefore we shouldn't give it much time of day. So that's his second criticism. He's looking at kind of competent judges there, and what else does he say here? He says that the human beings, the power of sacrificing their own greatest good for the greater good of others, refuses to admit that the sacrifice itself is good. A sacrifice which does not increase or tend to increase the sum total of happiness is wasted. So Simeon Stylites' sacrifice is wasted. It doesn't increase the sum total of good, and therefore it's pretty pointless. What we should be doing is trying to find this balance where we're impartial and we seek the greatest good of the greatest number, the aggregate, the sum total, and we act as a disinterested and benevolent spectator, a bit like Jesus's golden rule: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And that ideal utilitarianism, which is where we enshrine that ideal of each's interest to count equally, and therefore we seek the greatest good, the general good, rather than our own specific good. That means that there's an indissoluble association between our own happiness and the good of all. You're unable as a utilitarian to conceive of your own happiness except when it's in relation to the general good, and you wouldn't consider it happiness if it was in opposition to the general good. And this should cultivate habits of action and sentiments in you that are noble in character. He's saying that it's not over demanding as a philosophy. He looks at human psychology and he says that 99/100 of our actions are done from motives of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, not from Kantian motives of duty. Kant's all very well saying you should act for the summum bonum, you should act purely rationally, impartially, in pursuit of duty, the precious jewel that is good intrinsically in and of itself. But he's saying 99/100 of our actions are not done from that basis. If you just observe human psychology, we pursue self-interest and happiness. And if you can wire that into the general good, and you can say, can you urge people to pursue happiness and the mitigation, the lowering of suffering, then you're going to make strides forward, because you're kind of aligned with, you're harnessing human psychology rather than denying it as Kant does. So the multiplication of happiness is the object of our virtue, and this is what we should be aiming for. So criticism number 4 is that it makes people cold and unsympathizing. It chills their moral feelings, and they're kind of dry and hard in their consideration of others. you know, they don't really care. They're kind of like, I suppose, Jeremy Bentham, and he is kind of criticizing Bentham at this point. He says, utilitarians who've cultivated their moral feelings, page 197 at the bottom, but not their sympathies or their artistic perceptions, fall into this mistake. They don't see the beauty of character, they don't see the usefulness of rules, and they haven't cultivated their moral feelings, which have a lot to do with maximizing pleasure. And he says that among utilitarians, there's every imaginable degree of rigidity, you know, hard rule utilitarianism, and laxity, act utilitarianism. And so there's huge variety, and you shouldn't lump all utilitarians in together and say they're all cold and hard and unsympathizing and they're steely-eyed in the way they approach things. He's saying as well, you know, don't be naive about feelings and sympathy. It's all very well saying, oh, he acted from the noblest of motives, but unfortunately didn't calculate very well and the consequences didn't fall out well for him. Or, you know, he's such a kind of kind and caring person, but he's just not very competent as a doctor. So, no, you should look at actions, not just in terms of disposition of character, but also those that produce good or bad conduct. You know, what's the end product of them? One example is often quoted is Friar Nicholas de las Casas, who, when huge amounts of Latin American indigenous people were enslaved when the conquistadors, the Spanish conquistadors, came to Latin America, he appealed to the King of Spain to maybe ease their lot, these slaves, by sending over some slaves from Africa. And in doing so, he kind of launched the transatlantic slave trade that saw the deaths of 12 million people, or saw the passage of 12 million slaves. So there's a man who was, you know, from the noblest of motives, drawn in human sympathy towards the indigenous peoples of Latin America, appealed at risk to himself to the King of Spain, and brought about the transatlantic slave trade. So don't think that, you know, the best of motives and the most sympathetic of character is going to solve all your moral problems. You've got to ultimately judge ethics on outcome. What does it deliver? That's not to say that you shouldn't see the value of dispositions of character like sympathy and empathy that generally lead to the greater good. And we should cultivate those in children. So it's not true to say you can lump all utilitarians in and they're all like Bentham. It's a very mixed bag, utilitarianism, and we shouldn't treat them all the same. Number 5, it's a godless morality. This is saying that we should get our ethics from the character of God and his revelation in Scripture, and that's where we should go for our knowledge of right and wrong. But he's saying there's nothing, you know, particularly inconsistent between utilitarianism and religion. In fact, it's not a godless doctrine, but a profoundly religious doctrine, just as much as any other, because it emphasizes the greater good, and it's in step with the spirit of true religion. If God, who's the creator, desires the happiness of his creatures, utilitarianism is a very practical way to bring that about. So it just doesn't conflict with religion. Number 6, objection number 6, it's just expedient. It's unprincipled. The end justifies the means. If torture is the best way to extract information from people, go ahead and torture. If saturation bombing will help you win the war and lose less lives in the long run, go ahead and saturation bomb. If dropping the A-bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima will bring about a quicker end to the war in the Pacific, do it. So it's expedient and unprincipled. And in response to this, he wants to say, look, any philosophy can be used to make exceptions for yourself. So he gives the example of a minister in government that wants to keep himself in power, and so he lies, or he sacrifices the interest of his country. He puts maybe the party or his own political career ahead of the interests of the country. And you know, that's what human nature can do. But that's not utilitarianism. That's just human nature. Any philosophy could have, any moral system could have someone who, for expedient reasons, for self-interest, tells a lie and makes an exception for themselves. Even rule-based morality could make an exception, and it could be used inconsistently to violate the principles of the subject. So to say utilitarianism is just expedient and people are forever making exceptions to rules in their own interests is to say any philosophy or any ethical system can be misused to find loopholes to justify one rule for us and other rules for other people. But if you're genuinely a utilitarian, you think about the greatest good of the greatest number, and you think about the aggregate good, the sum total happiness of good. So again, we might say that there's not time to calculate the actions. This is carrying on with number 6 here. There's simply not the time to calculate the actions. Sorry, number 7. You don't have time to calculate individual acts and weigh up the pleasure and the pain that they'll bring. And so you need rules. And we should therefore go with a rule-based system of ethics. Now, he gives an example here, and I'm just going to share this screen with you because it's a nice example that he brings out here. So he talks about the nautical almanac, and he says that we don't always have the time. This is the bottom of page 200. Sailors cannot wait to calculate the nautical almanac. Being rational creatures, they go to sea with it ready calculated. This is a nautical almanac. This is the nautical almanac for 2020 by the United States Naval Observatory. It runs off Greenwich Mean Time, and essentially it gives sailors the positions of stars at any time in the year and any place in relation to Greenwich Mean Time in the world. And by using a sextant and various measures, you can calculate exactly where you are in the ocean, and that will help your navigation around land, or tell you how long it is before you arrive at land, having set off. So you don't calculate this in the middle of a storm. That's his point. You calculate the rules before you go into the sea. And in the same way, rules are not something that's opposed to utilitarianism. We have the first principle of ethics, which is utility, the usefulness of an action in bringing about pleasure and minimizing pain. But we certainly would be fools, he says at the bottom of page 200, to forbid the use of landmarks and direction posts along the way, whose aim is happiness. There is a road laid down to the goal of happiness. So we use rules because rules are the accumulated wisdom of past experience. They show us foresight, which is a human quality, and they therefore guide our principles. He says, you know, if it was an objection that there's simply not the time to always be able to calculate the consequences, so you should go off virtuous character, or you should go off duty to the rules. If that was the objection, then it could be made equally of religious ethics, you know, where you say, you know, there's not the time to read the entire Old and New Testament, as he says at the top of page 200, before deciding on what you should do about X, Y, and Z issue. In day-to-day life, rules are helpful guides, and utilitarianism is just as willing to draw on that wisdom as anybody else. It's certainly subordinate to, you know, it comes under this ultimate first guiding principle of the maximization of pleasure, the minimization of pain. But why not use rules if they have, like the almanac, they're kind of land-based calculations. They're kind of gathering the past experience so that when we come into the storm, they do give us guiding principles. So take the traffic laws. If we all stick to them, then we know that we'll save lives on the road. Everyone will be safer. So we just kind of go with the rules. They're useful at that point. So there's no real objection in this. There's not the time. We can draw on rules to help us with that. So we're on to objection number 8. This is that it's often open to abuse and self-interest. And as we've said, it's not just utilitarians that are prone to making exceptions to themselves. It's a common infirmity of human nature to do this. Many are apt to make their own particular case an exception to the rules, he says on page 201, and under temptation, they will breach a rule, they'll break a rule, more likely than they'll observe it. But this utility is not the only creed which furnishes us with excuses for evil doing and cheating on our own conscience. You know, that's just human nature. It's not utilitarianism in particular that's to be open to that charge. There's no ethical creed which doesn't temper the rigidity of its laws and give a certain latitude, a certain laxity or ease to accommodate the particularities of circumstances. So, you know, you say never steal, but if people are starving, then you might give them some license to do so, think that excusable. Self-deception and dishonest casuistry, kind of working a loophole for yourself, is not unique to utilitarianism. So what we've seen, to go back to our initial analogy of the chess game, is that utilitarianism is very good at, or Mill in particular is very good at anticipating every possible move that his opponents are making. He's stacked up 8 typical objections to utilitarianism, and he's replied to all of them in turn. So he's making utilitarianism far richer a system, and this is quite a different approach to Bentham. Bentham, as we've said, his task was to sort of take a very inconsistent legal system in Britain or in England and to try and systematize it, to codify it, to give it some consistency and rationality under the unifying principle of utility. What Mill's tried to do is kind of bring this into a whole personal ethic and a national kind of corporate ethic, where we can navigate the thorny dilemmas of life, both personally and in terms of national policy or whatever. So he's kind of building a bridge between law and ethics. It's a far wider life project. He's influenced by Aristotle and eudaimonic thinking, and he's kind of taking Bentham, who's a bit of a half thinker, and he's anticipating and dealing with the objections to utilitarianism Mark I, and providing a richer, more nuanced and defensively tight response to all of the objections that utilitarianism is accused of, and replying to them. So what I want you to do is to, as we've said, you take Dr. Browlatz's excellent notes here, and then underneath you write your thoughts. Now, if you've written any questions then, remember I've said questioning to philosophers is like water to fish. If you've written any thoughts or questions, please post the questions up on the post section of Microsoft Teams. In our lesson, I expect you to have watched both of these videos and to come ready to discuss and interrogate Mill's chapter. Do you think he's done a good job of demolishing all of the objections to utilitarianism? Have a think about those questions and write up your replies. Look forward to chatting to you in our next lesson.